it does seem that former President Trump is a bit on his toes. Now, Nikki Haley came in second, which we knew that was going to happen in New Hampshire, third in Iowa, but of course, DeSantis dropped out. Should Nikki Haley, does it make sense, let me say, for Nikki Haley to stay in?
She's going to lose, but why not stay in? If something happens to Donald Trump, then she'll suspend her campaign. And like DeSantis at the Republican National Convention, she could still be considered for the nomination. But did you hear the news this morning of Donald Trump in court, storming out of the courtroom, showing complete contempt for the court?
Yes.
It's astounding.
He doesn't want it. And now you're talking about the Arizona case, right? He was in Arizona.
I'm talking about the New York case,
the
defamation case.
Because I think he has to be in New York today because he was supposed to have some sort of rally. I saw that right before we came on. So this was the New York case where the judge told him, for people that don't know, you can only say yes or no. I don't think there's ever been a sentence that Trump has said that's only one
During
word.
Closing arguments today, Donald Trump stood up, stormed out of the courtroom. The judge is threatening sanctions against Donald Trump's lawyer. But you know what's fascinating to me? It's the complete contempt for the American justice system.
Oh, yeah.
The complete contempt for a federal court. And let me tell you something. If I were that judge, I would nail Donald Trump. I would make him pay for that contempt. And I think that's what's going to happen. Then the question is, will Republicans care?
No. They don't care. I mean, John, I'm sure you've also seen, even though I just saw a headline that Trump does not want it to happen, that the RNC basically, even though he does not have the delegate number yet, they want to just kind of crown him as the nominee. I mean, have you ever heard of something like that?
It is appalling. And I really want you to know the Republican National Committee was prepared to do it. They had to withdraw it because there were objections. But can you imagine the chair of the Republican National Committee, Ronna Romney McDaniel, saying, well, he's our presumptive nominee. He isn't presumptive until you have the delegate count.
Thank you.
And, I mean, it's the whole thing is so it's antithetical to everything that I have learned about in the political process.
Yeah.
And as for Nikki Haley, she'll lose in South Carolina. That will be the end of her formal candidacy. And Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. And that is an absolute disaster. Oh, here it is.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting that up. Court chaos, Trump storms out. And believe me, to stand up in a federal court and storm out, unbelievable. Unbelievable.
There's no consequence, John. I mean,
there will be.
Sanction the attorneys, but what are you going to do with this guy? This is
You're going to fine him. He is going to get a fine that will knock his socks off. And remember, there are several parts of this. It's not just what he will owe Carol. It's what he will then have to pay for compensatory damages. I think what Donald Trump has done is really not smart. But his supporters are going to love this. And he is going to gain such mileage from this. It's unbelievable. So that's what he's thinking. It's going to cost them some money, and he's willing to pay the price. But you don't understand. Here he shows such contempt for Carol, this woman who he assaulted all those years ago. And we're also dealing with the question of a woman's right to choose. How can any self-respecting woman, or for that matter, any self-respecting man, vote for Donald Trump? I don't get it.
I've been asking that question since the very beginning, since the grab him by the pee comment. It blows my mind. And then they love to stand on their morals, John. I love these people. The fact that the evangelical vote still goes to this guy blows my mind. And it's brainwashing. That's the only thing that I can think of is that they just, this is the other thing that I keep mulling over in my mind. Why don't they just want to get rid of him? Because he causes so much headaches. Is there no other Republican that agrees with Trump, but isn't a guy with so much baggage?
You know, a cult is a curious thing, Nikki. When you believe in someone, you cannot admit their faults.
Yeah.
And that is what is so remarkable. You and I can see it. And I tell you, I've been a Republican. I was very active in the Republican Party. I'm a Democrat now, but I've seen Donald Trump's faults. Look, I worked for Richard Nixon. I saw his faults. I had no problem calling him out on that. And that's the tragedy. When Donald Trump Jr. stood on the ellipse on January 6th and said, it's no longer the Republican Party, it's the party of Donald Trump.
Right.
He was right. And let me tell you, anytime you have one leader who is followed blindly.
Exactly. Off the cliff.
That's dangerous. And we've seen that in other countries. And I never, ever thought we would see it here. I was thinking of fictional movies. You were talking about things you watch on TV.
Yeah.
Everybody should watch Elmer Gantry, which is the story
Elmer
of
Gantry?
Yep, Elmer
Okay.
Gantry. Burt Lancaster. It was brilliant because he's a huckster. He's a religious huckster.
Mhm.
And he's dishonest as can get out. And he fools people. And I can tell you that is exactly what Donald Trump has done. When the spell is broken, it'll be fascinating to see how people respond to this situation.
I bet they'll make him into a martyr in some circles, which just boggles my mind. What are the rules, John? So let's say you say that you believe Nikki Haley will drop out after South Carolina. I mean, what are the rules with if Trump is deemed either not on the ballot, can't run for president, whatever happens with him? If he can't run anymore, then what happens? I mean, do people just write it in or?
No, it's the best question you could ever ask. And let me explain. That's why they are suspending their candidacies, not concluding them. So those candidates for president who have suspended their candidacies can get back in, if you will, if there's a vacancy at the convention. We have not had an open convention for any political party since 1952, when Adlai Stevenson was nominated on the third ballot. The simple truth is that if Donald Trump were, for any reason, not to be available during the convention to be the nominee, the Republican Party would have to scramble because you can't repeat the primary process.
Right.
But here's the kicker. You may remember when Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, he had amassed delegates to the Democratic National Convention. The question is, who would they vote for? So those delegates caucused in Chicago and decided to vote for George McGovern. Now, of course, they didn't have enough delegates to win the day, but the point was delegates then had a certain leeway. But it is fascinating. Now, the next question you might want to ask is, what happens if, after the convention, when Donald Trump is the nominee, something happens?
Right.
We have only one real example of that, and that was 1972, when Tom Eagleton was nominated for vice president, left the ticket, and then the Democratic National Committee chose the next candidate. Of course, the presidential candidate, George McGovern, said who he wanted. But you will recall it was Sergeant Shriver who was chosen to replace.
But that was for vice president.
Yes, but it was the National Committee's function to fill a vacancy because they don't call a new convention. There's no new convention. So after a convention concludes and makes the nominees, if something happens and you need a new nominee formally, that becomes the province of the National Committee of the political party.
Let's talk about some hot button issues, though. The first, the border. It's come out. Trump does not want Republicans working with President Biden, pardon me, with President Biden on any sort of border solution. Because just like Laura Ingraham said, we're not going to let him do, kind of a victory lap during his presidency on this. How does this play out? How does the border, especially with what Greg Abbott is doing with the barbed wire at the border, kind of going against judges' rulings on not doing that, basically? I mean, how does this play out politically right now when, if it's a crisis, why would you not work with the president on a solution?
Okay, let's deal first with Governor Abbott. And I want everybody to know that Governor Abbott of Texas may well be angling for the vice presidential nomination. But the point is, you're absolutely right. It's just a terrible thing. But you've asked a more fundamental question, and that is, where are the Republicans in the United States Senate, the greatest deliberative body in the world? And what are they doing? They're bowing to Donald Trump. It is unprecedented. I can remember examples when there has been this kind of interference, when senators have said, I'm not going to vote for you for that reason. Right. But this Republican Party is so weak in terms of its strength, that is to say, it's standing up, but it's a tragedy for the United States Senate. The greatest deliberative body in the world, the Republicans are bowing to Donald Trump. It's astounding. But that what you've said. Here's I see you've got Mitt Romney up. Do you want to play that? Can you play? I don't know.
Can you hit it, Kim? Kim's doing it for us. Let's go.
Good, thanks.
Okay, perfect.
Two minds in the conversation, but reading the reports this morning and the fact that he hasn't corrected them suggests that he is inclined to listen to what former President Trump wants. And former President Trump has indicated to senators that he does not want us to solve the problem at the border. He wants to lay the blame for the border at Biden.
Exactly.
And the idea that someone running for president would say, please hurt the country so I can blame my opponent and help my politics is a shocking development.
Do you think
Just horrible.
That's
and let me tell
insane.
you, the fact that Republicans in the United States Senate would bow to Donald Trump on this for pure political expediency, you know what they're afraid of? They're afraid that if they don't support Trump, he'll primary them. He'll get somebody to run against them in a primary, or it's political intimidation, it's blackmail, and it's so offensive to me, and it's a tremendous blow to the United States Senate. If you want to understand the power of the United States Senate, there are many movies that you could watch, but I think that the best is Advise and Consent, starring Charles Lawton, among other brilliant actors. Came out in 1960. It was filmed in the United States Senate itself. They were given permission to do it, and it explains how balance of power works. So I advise you to watch Advise and Consent. It is one of the most brilliant movies ever made.
Trump is calling on states to deploy the National Guard to Texas as they're kind of debating this. Does this kind of give Trump a little bit of cover for what he's telling senators?
I don't think so. And I think the idea of deploying the National Guard to a state border on a federal matter is, again, unconscionable. It's a political ploy. It's not serious. And I want to underline and emphasize that Governor Abbott may go along with it, but I don't even think he's particularly happy about it, because they're talking about the feds taking over the Texas National Guard as well as other National Guards from other states.
Right. Now let's move on to how Biden is dealing with all of these headlines. I'm going to play you a little bit of this news report. Larry Kudlow talking about what is a good headline for President Biden, although Republicans will definitely try to swing it around.
Look, it was a good quarter. Don't get me wrong. 3.3% beat estimates. And the last quarter was a good quarter, 4.9%. Absolutely. So he gets his due. If I were he, I'd be out slinging that hash too. No problem. I want to say one thing. When you look under the hood, though, and this is the same story, we've seen this again and again, the single biggest category was government spending.
So how do we break down those numbers? Like, he's blaming the federal government spending, and that's why the economy is doing well. What's your take on that?
Well, the answer is the economy is doing well. Unemployment is down. Inflation is down. The economy is booming. The stock market is at record highs. And frankly, your 401ks are doing very, very well. I have to tell you that the Republicans have to downplay it. If this were a Republican in the White House, they'd be cheering. But with Joe Biden, they've got to attack him. This was the subject in part of my my commentary yesterday on Around the Political World with John Rothmann. That was the commercial. That there is this incredible growth and strength in the economy. Let me tell you something. Inflation is a killer, but inflation is going down. Did you hear the news? I drive an electric car, so, well, it doesn't bother me, but gas prices are going down.
Yeah.
So this is something the Republicans have to understand. The very issues that they are trying to throw up at Biden, he's succeeding on. And one of the most important political developments of the week, the United Auto Workers have endorsed Joe Biden for re-election. That is a marvelous move from his point of view, because he needs to carry Michigan, and I think that will go a long way to helping him carry that great state.
But this is the thing, John. Every time there is a feather in the cap of Joe Biden, what do Republican and Republican commentators say? Be afraid of a President Kamala Harris. Can you explain to people why Republicans hate Kamala Harris so much? Besides the fact that she's a Democrat, but
she's a Democrat. She's a woman. She's a woman of color. And I've known Kamala. The first radio talk show she ever appeared on was my radio talk show.
I didn't know that.
KGO. She wrote me a beautiful letter thanking me because I made it easier, as she said. I didn't think I did, but she felt that, which is part of the charm of being a good host, as you well know. But let me just say, vice presidents are the traditional whipping boy of presidential campaigns. Richard Nixon was the whipping boy in 1956 and 52, but I remember Adlai Stevenson describing Nixon land. Or do you remember the wonderful commercial about Spiro Agnew. And by the way, you can pull that up at Living Room Candidate, where the name Spiro Agnew is said, and all you hear is hysterical laughter. And of course, I remember Dan Quayle and the jokes we used to make about if Quayle became president, oh, we quail at the thought. So my point is to you, a vice president has no record. A vice president really has only one constituent, and that is the president of the United States. Kamala Harris may be the whipping boy, but let me point out to you, the lowest ratings imaginable were for Harry Truman at one point. And remember, he'd served only 82 days as vice president, became president. They used to joke to air is Truman, take off onto air is human.
Right.
And the point is, once you're president, you make your own record. What would happen if something happened to Joe Biden today? Kamala Harris would be the nominee. I'm absolutely certain of it. They are running as a team. They made their first appearance this week together.
Right.
And so it is the Biden-Harris administration. So I would suggest to you that she is in a formidable position. And once you're president of the United States, if that were to happen, she would be judged on her own record. And I've known Kamala Harris for a long time. And let me tell you, she's tough, she's smart. And although people may laugh at her now, and I could tell you vice presidential jokes for her. Oh, may I tell you one? Just one.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I know you have to.
The mother who had two sons, one went to sea, the other became vice president, and neither one was ever heard from again. Now, let me just point out that if you listen to Fox, you will know that Kamala Harris is the greatest villain. She's a disaster.
Yes,
She's
exactly.
But that's Fox. That's what I expect from them.
But is there something about her and what they think she can do as president that frightens Republicans? It seems so, and I understand she's, the vice president of President Biden, but is there something about her and her politics and what she might be as president that scares Republicans?
Yes. I think they know that she really is very smart. She is a genuine liberal. She is a California Democrat. She has taken very strong stands over the years. I happen to like her. I think she is very articulate, very clear. Oh, they'll criticize her for her cackle,
Yeah, and that's just so sexist in my opinion.
Well, it's ridiculous. But it's like they'd criticize me if I ran for president for my hairstyle. So I'm always, I don't want to make a joke about it, but Kamala Harris is in all likelihood one day going to be president of the United States, either because something happens to Joe Biden or because when Joe Biden retires, she will be the Democratic nominee for president. And let me point out to you that Gavin Newsom, who many view as the leading opposition, has said he won't run against the Kamala Harris. He will not do it. And I don't think anybody else will either. She will get her legs when she is on the spot. And really, you can't judge anybody until they're in the Oval Office.
Of course.
By the way, the last vice president who became president to be denied the nomination of their party was in 1884. It was Chester Alan Arthur, who was defeated for the nomination by James G. Blaine. Nobody else will remember that. But what I want you to be aware of is if you are an incumbent president, for whatever reason, the odds are you're going to be renominated. And that is what we learned from Ronald Reagan's challenge to Gerald Ford and Teddy Kennedy's challenge to Jimmy Carter. Incumbents are renominated.
Yeah. And it's going to be really interesting to see how it goes. This whole presidential election has me stressed out. I'm optimistic that the voters will come out again as they did in 2020. Do you think the passion to go against Trump is as strong as it was in 2020?
I think it's more so.
Yeah.
And I think the arrogance that he demonstrated today by storming out of that courtroom, the fact that he will be fined heavily for what he's doing, should have an impact on people. Now, I say should, but remember, you're never going to convince the die-hard Trump supporters that he can do anything wrong. But it's the middle. It's the middle. Remember, Donald Trump has never won the popular vote in a national election. He went down by 9 million last time, or 7 or 9.
7 million, I think it was. Yeah, something like that.
And this time, it'll be an even bigger margin. And as for the swing states, all you have to do is take a look at a state like Kansas, which is a solid Trump kind of state. On the question of a woman's right to choose, they rejected the more extreme position. I will confess I'm a little Pollyannish. It's like you tap dancing.
Yes.
I believe that the American people fundamentally, when confronted with a situation, know what to do. And I believe Donald Trump will learn that lesson. You can't win a presidency in a national election from a narrow base. You have to have a large base.
Yeah.
Donald Trump doesn't have that base. Did you note, by the way, I think it was in New Hampshire that 11%, I think it was 11% of the voters said they'd never vote for Donald Trump?
Yeah.
If that's a national trend, he's in big trouble.
Absolutely. And remember that, in the primaries, it's the diehards that come out. I mean, I was talking about Iowa. 15%, I think, 15% of Republicans actually voted in the Iowa caucus. And so for Trump to be like, I won in a landslide, winning in a landslide of 15% of the state isn't much of a landslide in my
And there will be a huge voter turnout. It's not only the presidency, it's the Senate, it's the House of Representatives. Yeah. And I'm going to tell you, the Republicans were counting on taking back the House. Doesn't look like it to me. I think the Democrats are going to take the House. And as for the United States Senate, what should be close, the Republicans are nominating their weakest candidates for the United States Senate so far, which is what they did in 2022. So look, let me tell you, I'm a realist. I'm not a partisan when it comes to this. I can count numbers, and I can see clearly on the horizon a wreck. Then the challenge will be when Donald Trump loses, as I believe he will, and the Republican Party will then have to emerge from the darkness of the Trump years and determine where it will go. And Nikki, you and I will have a lot to talk about in the days ahead over the Republican Party. Let me be clear. The Republican Party has to rebuild. It has to redefine itself. It has to get out of the shadow of Donald Trump and into the broad daylight of really having a political party that works.
Can I ask you one more quick question about the Senate? I'm assuming, I know you watched the U.S. Senate debate. Here's the thing I was thinking about. Obviously, I am a Katie Porter supporter. I have nothing against Barbara Lee or Adam Schiff. She's just the one that I particularly like. I don't think we can win for lose with either of the candidates, obviously, except Steve Garvey. But Steve Garvey said something that stuck with me a little bit. And it's this idea of, California, when it went just predominantly blue, right? A Democratic rule up and down the state. Do you foresee us ever moving towards the center? Because every time I think about that, I'm like, I would consider listening to a Republican, maybe about, the budget or what we fund. But that party has skewed so extreme. We can't give them an inch, because when we give you an inch, what happens? We lose fundamental constitutional rights.
No, you're absolutely right. Look, I remember when the Republican Party was a competitive party here in California. Indeed, yes. I'm old enough to remember when it was the dominant party here in California. Those days are over. And Steve Garvey, if he wins, it would be not wins, but gets into the runoff. Right. I happen to think it's going to end up Schiff versus Porter in the
That's runoff. What I was thinking too.
Two Democrats. By the way, her great line that night at the debate about the artful Dodger,
yes.
Meaning
once a Dodger, always a Dodger,
was just perfect. But I'm realistic enough to understand that I would prefer a state of California where you have a choice between a Democrat and a Republican. We made the mistake here in this state of deciding the top two would run off against each other. And that means it's a Democrat versus a Democrat in all likelihood. I'm not impressed by Steve Garvey.
No.
And one other quick point, I know we've got to close, but let me just say the latest polls show that in the March 5th primary here in California, that Donald Trump is going to sweep California in terms of delegates to the Republican National Convention. There is no real opposition to Donald Trump. And that will be another blow to the Republican Party in this state. I want a vital, vibrant two-party system. I want to have a choice. And that's the shame of it all.
Well, exactly. I can't consider, because even Steve Garvey, he tried to dance around it, but he's a total Trump supporter. It came out in everything that he said, and it wasn't much. He definitely spoke in broad generalities. I want to do this and that, but no real policy, which seems to be the Republican MO. But until they get it together, until the Republican Party figures out who it is, and hopefully is a party that can work across the aisle, because I just don't think they will. They're all about the wins and the Democratic losses. They'll never have my vote. They'll never have my consideration. And I know so many other voters feel exactly the same way.
And that's why if you ask, who is the leader of the Republican Party here in California, there isn't one.
Yeah, there
isn't.
And
that's the tragedy. Remember when we had Pete Wilson, George Duke Machen, even Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Even Arnold Schwarzenegger, yeah.
It's a tragedy. And let me tell you, I love California politics. Once upon a time, the governor and both United States senators were Republicans. That goes back to the 50s. Knight, Noland, and Kuechel. those days are over, and the Republican Party better understand that. But let us hope for a better day. Maybe a catastrophic loss will cause them to rebuild and rethink.
Let's hope, from your lips to God's ears.
May I
John
just
Rothman.
close? I've got to close by saying support the Nikki Maduro program.
Please.
Kim McAllister, do go to the various ways that you can support the program. Remember, they do this, but it's because of public support. It's because of your support. And I want to make sure everybody makes sure to sign up. And that applies to the Mark Thompson Show as well. This is so important for free speech and all the rest. And Nikki, we love you on KCBS. And when you are not with us, Kim McAllister does such a fabulous job.
She does. Look at that face. Absolutely.
Hi.
So make sure you follow John Around the Political World with John Rothman. It's like 10 minutes, very easy to listen to. And John Rothman is such a political expert. We love having you as an addition to our show as well. Have a great weekend. Go Niners, John.
Bye.
See you next week. Bye-bye.